The Rapier is commonly referred to as the best damage per second or DPS weapon in New World. But why? Understanding how we came to this conclusion is crucial to understanding what makes your build good and how to improve your damage even further. In New World, damage is calculated using a very complicated formula that can be basically broken down into this formula. Damage dealt is equal to the amount of outgoing damage you're putting out times the damage mitigation the enemy has. Pretty much with DPS, we're going to be focusing on this outgoing damage, since damage mitigation is something we can't control. Outgoing damage is calculated by multiplying your base damage by your empower, or the buffs you have to improve damage. Part 2, the competition. Although Rapier is commonly referred to as pretty much your only DPS option, as you play in raids, mutations, any PvE content, there are a couple other ones that can put up a good fight. Let's look at the Greatsword. The Greatsword's strategy revolves around the Onslaught passive. On the left side of the Greatsword skill tree, using charged heavies or an Onslaught ability puts you in Onslaught stance, which means you charge heavy attacks 50% quicker, and your outgoing damage is multiplied by 15%. You do take 15% increased damage, and your heavy attacks, which you were focusing on, can take a while, and so sometimes it feels clunky or sluggish, and with the 15% increased damage taken, you kind of have low survivability, especially when you're mid-animation. Hatchet is another great option. Most people look at Hatchet because of its amazing ability, Berserk. Berserk provides empower, 20% increased damage. It has a good amount of survivability with the Defy Death passive, and so if you take a hit that would normally kill you, you get revived pretty much and don't go down. It also has the weapon perk Keen Berserk, which multiplies your crit chance and your crit damage, leading to many strategies revolving around this, maximizing that damage. It also has an excellent ability called Torrent. It's a series of quick attacks, similar to Flurry, if you're familiar with that although have slightly lower base damage, you're attacking much quicker, and so you end up doing a lot more damage. It also has a phenomenal weapon perk called Refreshing Torrent, which means each hit of Torrent refreshes your cooldowns, reduces your cooldowns by a certain amount, meaning you are spending almost no time non-berserked. Especially with builds like Freya's Francesca, you can spend almost entirely all of your time in berserk. SNS is also a great option when it comes to damage per second. It has great options with the perk that allows heavy attacks to give you 30% in power. Leadership, meaning everyone in your group has 10% in power. It also has some good cooldown reduction in Upheaval, reducing all cooldowns by 20%, and it has a very high base damage with Upheaval, being a 200% base damage modifier, the highest in the game, equivalent to that of Power Shot by Musket. This leads to hits as high as 27,000 damage with Upheaval. The con to SNS, or Sword and Shield, is it can be a little slow. It doesn't have that much cooldown reduction in between upheavals. Besides just upheavaling and spamming light attacks with the odd heavy attack, you're not really doing much else. Now we get to Rapier. Rapier, if we look at it at the surface, has amazing cooldown reduction. It's got pretty solid base damage with the right side, and it has incredible survivability with options like Riposte and Evade, allowing you to dodge attacks. The con to Rapier, though, is it naturally has a lower base damage because you hit a little bit quicker and you have low cooldowns. Looking at it from this perspective, it all seems pretty even. Part 3, Empower. Although a lot of these weapons have abilities to give themselves empower, a niche rule that you might not be aware of in New World's code means empower can only be capped at 50%, meaning if we go back to that formula with outgoing damage, that base damage can never be multiplied by more than 1.5%. This means if you have more than, 50% in power, it's wasted. It doesn't do anything. No big deal, right? With the exception of Sword and Shield, none of these even come close to 50. This brings us to exterior empowers. I like to refer to these as empowers not built into the weapon design itself. Common ones that you may not be aware of are gear perks like ring damage, thrust damage, or ice damage, or slash damage on your ring, plus 7% counts towards empower. Empowering toast on your earring as well is 10% empower. And then even elemental harnessing on your armor, if you're using a mage weapon, that counts towards empower. Now we get to your teammates. In raids, you're commonly going to have someone using Sword and Shield, giving everyone in their group leadership. And then your 2 healers are commonly going to be using Void Gauntlet. So now you have Oblivion, an extra 15% empower. The Flail healer, now running Vortex, which is an extra 10% empower. And the Flail ability passive, Pack Leader, is yet another 10% empower. If we combine that roster, or how we design the group, in your group as a DPS, you're going to have Leadership, Oblivion, Vortex, and Pack Leader. Combined, this is already 45% empower. Slap a Honing Stone on it, as little as common tier 3 homing stones, you are already at 50% empower. So there is no need for any empower in the build. This destroys some of the builds or other damage options you have. Like Greatsword, Onslaught Stance is technically an empower, so that 15% outgoing damage doesn't count anymore. Relentless Rush giving 10% empower also doesn't count anymore. This hits Hatchet hard, as Berserk's 20% increased damage is not base damage. It is an empower. And so now, the only benefit of Berserk is the crit chance and crit damage. And then with Sword and Shield, most of its build revolves around empower. And so those heavy attacks, that leadership that you could be running for yourself, they don't really matter anymore since they're way past cap. You are sitting at like 80%. 30% empower wasted. Part 4, what sets the Rapier apart from these other options? With Greatsword, now that we think about the nerf to the empower, since we're already at 50%, the only viable options for damage are using the artifact Serenity to increase the damage of your charged heavies, and that perk that gives you 5% bleed stacking up to 5 times. So an overall 25% weapon damage bleed. But this runs into a problem. On an enemy, only one of the type of debuff can be applied at the time. So that person that applies those 5 stacks of 25% bleeds takes that slot almost for that bleed. And so now no other greatswords in your group are going to apply bleeds. And so that loses out as well. SNS, Sword and Shield. It actually still has a pretty solid strategy using things like empowering Leaping Strike, which technically isn't an empower, to increase your base damage by almost 30%. Using Defender's Resolve is another 20% base damage. Combine those with Upheaval and you get pretty big numbers still. Even if you pair it with an Inferno, now the Inferno artifact, you get an extra 15% damage when you're close to something, which is all the time as a Sword and Shield player. The cons to Sword and Shield are little to none cooldown reduction besides refreshing move and Upheaval. And again, slow kind of clumsy combos that can leave you vulnerable to attacks in between. Now we get to Hatchet. Since Berserk is now useful for crit damage and crit chance, the 20% damage bonus is irrelevant now. We look at the right side ultimate, which allows us to do 16% increased base damage to targets affected by a Hatchet debuff. We can use something like Rending Throw, to apply that debuff and a 20% rend. You can still utilize Torrent and Keen Berserk paired with an artifact like Sin, which increases your damage, base damage, for every debuff on the target to still get some pretty good damage. It's commonly thought of as the next best damage option besides Rapier. You lose out on the survivability of Defy Death, though, which, if you're maxing damage, we aren't really looking at either way. That brings us to Rapier. With Rapier, Empower Cap doesn't really affect it, as a lot of its abilities revolve around base damage. Using Evade, specifically Adagio, it increases the base damage of your next light attack. Base damage, not Empower. Same with the right side ultimate. Momentum, you are increasing the base damage. And then with Flurry, you still have that quick, pretty heavy hitting ability that refreshes its own cooldown. And so you are throwing out these evades and flurries very, very quickly. So even though your damage numbers aren't as high as something like Hatchet, you are hitting way quicker than Hatchet, even with how quick Hatchet already is. And so in the end, even from a base damage standpoint, we're looking at Rapier still. Hatchet and Rapier are kind of our two options. But what we're getting to is what sets the Rapier apart from Hatchet and those other options like Sword and Shield and Greatsword. This revolves around the left side tree, or the bleed tree in the Rapier skill tree. At the end of Flurry, there is a perk that allows it to apply a bleed. This bleed is 10% of your weapon damage for 10 seconds, and it stacks up to 3 times. But then we run into the same issue with Greatsword, where that can only be used once and just kind of sits there. No one else can apply it. Which brings us to the other ability and the ultimate of Bleed, of the Bleed side tree. Flourish and Finish. Flourish and Finish is a great ability because not only is it pretty strong base damage-wise as an ability, it has this unique perk where it consumes all of the Rapier bleeds on the target. They don't have to be applied by you. Other people can apply those bleeds and you can consume them for them. And not only does it consume them all at once, so that 10% damage over 10 seconds just combines into 100% damage right then, it multiplies that damage by 110%. And then once you get to the ultimate, it multiplies that damage by 150%. So now you're doing 150% weapon damage at the end of every flurry on top of the already quick flurry and evade combo that just pumps out damage. Now we're getting to part 5, the beauty of Rapier's weapon design. There is so many little intricacies that go into how much damage Rapier does. Let's just first look at Flurry applying that bleed. In the game code, that bleed is just labeled as Rapier bleed. And so that bleed from Tondo, that Tondo applies, is the same bleed. And so it's under the same code, which means that Keen Tondo, the weapon perk that you find on Finisher and other Rapiers, applies even if it's only bleeding from Flurry. No one has to use Tondo anymore to get that Flurry bleed. This frees up an extra slot for our Flourish and Finish players to be able to use Evade to pump out even more damage. Not only does Keen Tondo allow for evades, it increases your critical damage, which using the Blood Red Curtains passive means you get less cooldowns. Each time you critical hit, it reduces cooldowns. So every crit that is increased because of Keen Tondo means even more cooldown reduction, allowing you to flurry even more and apply even more bleeds. With all this cooldown reduction we have in place, without using any special artifacts like Nimble Coat or a refreshing move Rapier paired with Inferno, if we're just using Finisher with some attuned leather pants, we can go through this entire Evade Rapier and Evade Flurry combo in less than 4 seconds. So you are applying that bleed every 3.5 seconds. Especially if you have Nimble Coat or a refreshing move, you get even more cooldown reduction. So now you're applying that flurry bleed in almost 3 seconds flat. Which takes us to our next point. How do we maximize the damage from bleeds? There's a couple perks in the game that help us with that, specifically Disdained Infliction, or the perk you see on almost all of the hoplite weapons. Putting this on something like Finisher allows us to do 15% more base damage on our bleeds. That potency is not duration, it is the damage itself. So now 10% multiplied by that extra 15%, you're looking at 11.5% weapon damage over 10 seconds. But 10 seconds isn't the limit. Most duration-based things have a higher limit than what they initially get applied as. In this case, this Rapier bleed, its limit is 18 seconds. So now you're looking at 11.5% weapon damage over 18 seconds. Now, how do we get to that 18-second amount? Well, each time you apply a bleed, it refreshes those stacks back to 10%. And with Disdained Infliction, every hit extends your duration over times or your bleed by an extra 5%. And then halfway down Flurry, we have a perk that extends, again, Rapier's bleed for each hit of Flurry. Which means pretty much instantaneously after a couple hits, that bleed is capped at 18%, or 18 seconds, sorry. And now it's available to be consumed for 11.5% weapon damage over 18 seconds. Now that we have these bleeds maximized, we can maximize the other part of the rotation, or using the right side tree, Momentum, Evade, Riposte, Flurry, all are great perks that we find on that tree. Starting out, since we don't need everyone running Flourish and Finish, we can utilize our last perk as Riposte and use the right side passive of Momentum. Momentum increases the base damage of 30% for your next light attack, similar to Adagio. But with this, you get 40% increased base damage each time you evade, which is almost multiple times a second. And so you're constantly hitting numbers like 8, 9K. Most people should be looking at least 8K on your evade hits, or momentum autos as some people refer to it. This number is pretty big. It doesn't really compare to that upheaval at 25,000 damage, but considering we're using it way quicker than upheaval, it's happening every second, whereas upheaval takes 8 seconds to get back to. It ends up being quite a bit of damage, just ignoring the bleeds that it applies as well. And so this allows us to use Riposte. And so these evade rapiers is usually what we call them, that don't run Flourish and Finish, have incredible survivability, because not only does evade give you a moment of invulnerability, Riposte counters any attack, and it's very easy to use it. And then this brings us to another weapon perk with Leeching Flurry. It allows us to heal or lifesteal from each hit of Flurry, like 33% damage, which when you're running low amounts of Constitution and you're hitting, each Flurry is hitting for like 4,000, you can heal back to full with just a single Flurry from nothing. Not only do we get lifesteal from it, it gives us another half second of invulnerability. Combine that with evade and riposte, you are constantly invulnerable. Like, it's very easy to dodge attacks. And so it allows us to run even less Constitution, and so that we can put more points into dexterity and intelligence to get those passives that do tons for the build. Omni Evade is a weapon perk or a ability perk for evade. What it does is every time you evade, you get 11% increased base damage if it's on your armor, which it should be, not on your weapon, because it's an empower, and so it's already capped. This 11% increased base damage comes at no cost. You can just put it on your armor, and it's not replacing any other perk that you need there. And so with it there, you don't need to have a sword and shield in your group anymore to hit empower cap. As long as you got the other buffs, you're hitting empower cap already. And so this allows for even more build flexibility in the roster. It also means the Adagio upgrade, I convinced I'm saying that wrong, is applied in any direction. So you can evade backwards. And so you dodge more attacks. And you still get that base damage increase. Using all of this, it allows for a pretty impressive build. But that kind of comes as cost. Usually these high-end DPS builds are really expensive to build and not really good options for new players. But with Rapier, we have an amazing artifact called Finisher to pair with it. And this means Finisher has a special perk that allows us to do 15% more damage to targets suffering from a bleed, which is all the time. And so it's another 15% damage increase. And so using Finisher and something as simple as like attuned leather pants compared with light armor and getting refreshing is already a great option for DPS. It is something you can build within the first week of playing if you are really dedicated. It costs almost nothing to build, especially since you consider if you were running something like Hatchet, not only do you got to upgrade your main hand, you got to upgrade your armor, and so that it has Keen Berserk and Refreshing Torrent and Rending Throw and all these other perks that you simply don't need with Rapier. It's very simple. Like, it has very low requirements, being empowered on the amulet so that short empowers you get from using your abilities last indefinitely, because by the time it runs out, you've already used another one, refreshing the duration. Something like Keen Awareness on the ring means more crits, meaning more cooldowns, meaning more flurries and more bleeds. And so it's a very easy build and very budget if you're looking for just something you can do. If you're mainly a PvP player, it's very easy to build, almost no investment, and allows you to do this high-level PvE play to get that gear that you want, like the heavy boots from Worm, or the light or medium chest piece with Keen on it. Looking at all these pros or good things about the Rapier just really makes it shine among its competition in a way that it can't be substituted by almost any other option. It fulfills every single role, has good damage, has good survivability, all while being able to allow for various builds. Rapier emerges as the most prominent option because of this. It doesn't have many cons or downsides to using it. And so, in my opinion, this complex weapon design, all these little perks that go into extending bleeds, cooldown reduction, increasing base damage, getting empower from other players is so intricate and interesting and is among the best I've ever seen in any MMO I've ever played. Most of the time, it's just brain dead spamming heavy attacks like Greatsword. But no, it's very intricate and allows for lots of creativity when you're getting a group together. And so that's why, in my opinion, it is literally the best option for damage per second and has a damage class. And so that, all of it combined, is what I would call the art of the Rapier.